session, Future-Proofing People, Places and Spaces. And this next session, which is on leadership and governance, developing a new model of stewardship, I'm really pleased to introduce Andy Wood, who's the Exeter and East Devon Growth Point Director, and Councillor Ray Bloxham, who is from Cranbrook Town Council. So, over to you. Andy first, thank you.
Thank you, good afternoon. So I'm going to kick off with a few slides and then hand over to Ray. We're going to try and pick up some themes from this morning's session as we go along if we can. I was going to start here, and this probably relates to Danny's, one of Danny's slides, who reminded us that the origins of the town planning system actually were in public health outcomes and achieving better public health outcomes. So these are the Garden Town principles. You may be aware of the Garden Towns movement, which probably stretches back over 100 years now, and some fairly well-established principles around governing a whole range of things that have been touched on today, from, for example, access to green space, quality of design. But I was going to start with the top two in red, which are strong vision, leadership and community engagement, and secondly, community ownership of land and long-term stewardship of assets, and about how some of those things have kind of come forward and evolved in Cranbrook. So in terms of key features, again, some of this has been touched on, and to probably link with something that Mark said about the role of the state earlier. It's interesting for me, it's a very commercially driven model. I think Kenji mentioned it's the kind of normative model for housing delivery in the country. And particularly no public ownership of land and no council housing stock either. It's provided the affordable housing by two registered providers. So, you know, one of the conclusions I've kind of come to think about is whether Cranbrook is a kind of part privatised town in the sense, and I'll come back to this, around how it's kind of evolved and when you conceptualise the model. It's also important to think about the impact of how Cranbrook has evolved. Mark mentioned, it started back in the very early 90s, and some of this was negotiated in terms of Section 106 agreements in a very different era, in terms of public finances pre-last recession as well. And that for me is a key thing. We haven't touched much on cost today, but the cost of service delivery is for me a key driver about how we move forward as well. I think this is picked up by, in the kind of King's Fund elements as well, about the kind of Wigan example. I refer to it as beyond planning. Variously, you could describe it as place leadership, place making, but how do you stitch together all of those different things that go to make up the kind of places that we enjoy? And how does that relate to both the physical environment, but also our responsibilities around service delivery as well? How do those things kind of hang together, if that makes sense? And finally, and then Virginia touched on this in opening as well, is around the demographic profile. Was it predicted? Absolutely. The health impact assessment set out pretty clearly, based on examples elsewhere, what we could expect in terms of the little symbol there, in terms of a young population. But was that embraced across the whole kind of pantheon of different service providers? Did we really understand that? Including the social profile as well, the amount of affordable housing in the first phases of Cranbrook and what that was going to mean going forward. I think that's a challenge. And again, that role around kind of wider role of partners and partnership working and stakeholders, how do you engage with that wider community is part of the mix here in terms of the Cranbrook model. So what is that model? As I mentioned, firstly, the Section 106, I think, took 4 years to negotiate. I managed to endure a recession at the time, but a lot of those things that started out in the Section 106 obligations, that funding package of critical community infrastructure that was needed to support a new town, for me the challenge is, well, if you're going into a more austere environment, how do you avoid the fact that Cranbrook becomes, if you like, austerity town? If those things were needed in 2006, how do you deliver them now in a different financial regime? One of the things that was planned into, critically from my perspective, into the if you like, the kind of legal mechanisms underpinning the town was a community governance review. Cranbrook, at its fullest extent of around kind of 8,000 homes, will, if you wound back the clock kind of 10 years ago, it would have covered 4 different parishes. And so the real challenge of a community governance review, creating a new Cranbrook parish, and ultimately a Cranbrook Town Council, and hence Ray, formed back in May 2015. And for me also, there's been quite a lot of, how do different tiers of local government operate together, and a pretty big role for the third tier of local government here in terms of how it steps up and takes on some of those things. In a lot of places, a lot of new developments, for very understandable financial reasons, things like play areas, like drainage